You have probably heard of the term ecosystem before. Now, as you can probably tell given it says system in the word, it is a system of interconnected things. So what things are these? Well, they are living organisms and their environment. What's in the environment? Well, okay, let's think about a deer, for example. We see an organism, a community, and what's this? What's this in the middle? This is called a population. So, a population of organisms, a group of organisms. Say you have deer. Now you have a group of deer. The community is, well, think about your neighborhood. So there are many different people, many different groups of people, many different families, right? So we see wolves, we see butterflies, we see birds. What's a community of animals? A community of animals is essentially all the different species of animals and plants for that matter. But the thing is, when you say community of animals, clearly you mean animals. A community in general is all the species living in an area. Now, what about the area itself? The trees? Oh wait, no. The trees are living. They're part of the community. What about the soil? Or the climate? Well, they are part of the abiotic environment. They are not due to life. Now, this is really funny, actually, because did you know that before plants came onto land, most of the interior of continents were essentially huge deserts? Why? Well, we know that when we have mountains at the edge of a continent, and this is pushed up by plate tectonics, so subduction of one plate under another results in this plate being pushed up and making these mountains. So if we have mountains and we take humid air, this is water, and we have humid air coming up, and it goes up, it makes a cloud, and it comes back down. The water comes back down and runs off back into the ocean. So most of the continents would have been a giant rain shadow. How do we get this water past these mountains? Well, other than a small amount that happens to fall on the other side, there's also the fact that it can get caught by plants halfway up, and then if that evaporates again, the evaporation conditions are different enough that a significant amount of it can get past the mountain. And then, what happens when plants spread inland to use the new water source? Well, more plants. And eventually, this results in the water coming down, going back up, coming back down again, and eventually, you get plants all over the continent. So essentially, plants carried water across continents, and they still do to this day. Which, by the way, is pretty much why the eastern, say, United States actually gets rained on, because of the plants further west. This also explains why the eastern United States used to be forest. Why? Well, forest actually takes considerably more rainfall to sustain than grassland. So out west, okay, you get past the mountains, you have big deserts. But enough water vapor still makes it past those deserts to make grassland, the prairie provinces for Canada, or the Midwest plains for the United States. So after the plains, when you have quite enough water transported and they happen to fall densely enough, well, you get forest. Now this might sound a little bit funny, because if we start with the same amount of water, why is it grassland here and forest over there? Well, some of that water makes a longer hop than the rest. And also, consider timing. If it comes down on grassland and it goes back up, think about how long it takes to go back up and then come back down. Forest requires more rainfall to sustain, but it also gives off, so to speak, more water vapor. That's why it requires more rainfall to sustain. So if it gives off more water vapor, if that comes down really fast, that just recycles. which is part of why forests tend to be found after grassland. So, what have we seen here? Well, we have seen that abiotic factors, the non-living parts, are very important, such as the mountains, and the living parts are also very important. By the way, clouds, even when they happen to be made by living organisms, are considered abiotic. So, even though biotic technically lists their remains and features such as nests associated with their activities, we don't associate clouds closely enough with photosynthesis, and transpiration for that matter, to count them. Transpiration is the natural loss of water from leaves when they open up their stomata to let carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. But you'll learn that in a later bio class. Alright, so ecosystems come in all sizes and descriptions. So here we see coniferous forest. The trees all look kind of pointed. There's a reason people draw coniferous forest as trees looking kind of pointed. It's because when it snows, when your branches look something like this, whenever it snows and it gets too heavy for the branch, instead of a deciduous tree would look something like this, and perhaps something bad would happen. Perhaps too much snow falls here and the branch snaps off. For a coniferous tree, the branch gets too heavy, it bends and the snow slides off. That's why coniferous trees are pointy. So these are some of the characteristic abiotic features. Let's see. Okay, so we have climate covered, long cold winters, warm summers, and rainfall is usually counted as part of climate, sure. Alright, much of it falls as snow. That's interesting information. Why? Well, it's also part of climate, but why is this part of climate? Because when snow falls matters as much as, if not more than, the total amount of rainfall. Consider areas where you have a monsoon season and a dry season. For example, you've all heard of tropical rainforests. They are pretty much rainy year-round. However, not too many people have heard of tropical seasonal forests. In tropical seasonal forests, it is so dry during the dry months. You can find these forests in Central America, for example. It is so dry during the dry months that most of the trees drop their leaves. Why? Because the leaves would require too much water loss for the trees to survive. So they drop their leaves and wait until it rains again, and then they put out new leaves. Just like in, say, northern climates, typically any broadleaf trees are deciduous, as in they drop their leaves. So technically there exists tropical deciduous forest as well as temperate deciduous forest. Coniferous just means it bears cones, which essentially means gymnosperms, as you would learn in biology. So trees that do not bear flowers or fruit per se. Now, of course, there have been people who have argued that some forms of gymnosperms can count as using fruit, but for the most part, those are completely different from angiosperm fruit, which angiosperm essentially means flowering plants, as far as we can. Now, wait a second. What is this? What's this? It says that the snow insulates and protects ground species. Did you know that up in the tundra, there are caterpillars who take shelter under boulders and take many years to turn from a caterpillar to whatever? They grow for many years as caterpillars, feeding for a few months at a time, and then they burrow under a boulder and hibernate to let the worst, most frigid months pass. So these species can take many years to become adults. Now that's very different from most caterpillars we're familiar with, right? because, say monarchs, they have several generations a year, even they have several generations per migration, north to south. Now, think about the last ice age. Alright, so huge sheets of ice covered much of North America. Now, the monarch roosts in summers on, well, they spend some time on mountain peaks, and then they come down, and then they go up, and then come down between seasons. And what happens when the ice age stops and the glaciers go back? Well, the climate that what used to be found on the mountain peaks essentially moves. It moves northward. What does this say? Or alternatively, for some other species, the climate they used to find at the bottom of the mountains moves northward, the warmer climate. What does this do? Well, it encourages these species to eventually evolve massive migrations, as I'm sure you have seen regarding documentaries or other things, educational material about monarchs and some other butterfly species. Biotic features. What does that mean? Well, we know biology is the study of living things. Geology is the study of the earth. So biotic means that it has to be living things, right? So there are a few species in a coniferous forest. Well, compared to places such as deciduous broadleaf forests or tropical rainforests. Now they're dominated by black spruce forest and bogs. This is for the most part true. Some coniferous forests, however, vary. So you might find ash, aspen, pine, cedar, and so on. All sorts of plants. Black bear, red squirrels, and moose. So essentially, in biotic features, what we actually list are the organisms that are there. And in particular, we list mostly apex predators and organisms that provide shelter for other organisms, or alternatively, take up a lot of the biomass. Look at this coniferous forest. What's the most common thing living there? If you're saying the trees, you are correct in the sense of biomass. They are in total the heaviest things that are living there. The most common things are without doubt some type of insect. Think about how many insects can live on a single tree. Yeah. So, many biting flies. Why do we list this under a characteristic biotic feature? Because we are humans, we are studying this from the perspective of humans, and we care about the implications to human health. Short growing season reduces ecosystem productivity. We also care about it from the angle of human economics. So, health and economics. All right, let's be shorter. Money. And up here is just the who, what, when, why, and how. So a coral reef. Coniferous forests are huge, typically, compared to most other ecosystems. I mean, the open ocean is obviously a lot bigger, but coniferous forests are essentially usually considered the largest terrestrial ecosystem. Of course, this depends on whether or not you divide it into taiga and boreal forest. Coral reefs are one of the most productive ecosystems. So here, for this aquatic ecosystem, we need to list water temperature. Usually, we also list water salinity for aquatic ecosystems. Why? Because regulating salt and water balance is important for anything that's alive, which means that it is an abiotic factor that we have to put serious attention to when we're studying any ecosystem. So, location, usually in tropical latitudes. Why? Because of the water temperature requirement. Also, in aquatic ecosystems, the depth is very important. Why? Because sunlight can only penetrate so far, even in very clear water. And Here they list sometimes used as a source of limestone. What does this tell us? This tells us something about the chemical composition of the substrate. Now, if you really wanted to be detailed, you might also list the chemical composition typically required in the water, for example, the acidity. When water is too acidic, most carbonate shell-building organisms cannot survive. So here, biotically, we list what's there. We list, well, we didn't list health here because it's not that relevant to human health compared to the boreal forest. Whereas, yes, we all know that, okay, there might be sharks, or might be poisonous jellyfish or similar, but we didn't list it here because it's not quite as obvious, for the major reason that fewer people go to coral reefs than go into the boreal forest or taiga. So, source of many valuable fish species, money, right? We are studying this from a human perspective, so for biotic factors, we will count not only who's there, what's there, and so on, how much is there, we also count their worth. And of course, we should consider their sensitivity to changes, i.e., how stable they are in the face of human challenges, such as pollution. Here we have a beaver pond. This is a small, really small ecosystem compared to the ones we were just talking about. So here it notes that dams may break, causing downstream flooding. This is an important abiotic factor because every disturbance is an important factor. For example, a biotic disturbance might be elephants frequently bulldoze through this area, or pigs frequently overturn the soil in this area. An abiotic factor would be a relatively more natural thing, such as flooding. Periodic flooding is important in many ecosystems, as I'm sure you have heard from social studies that the Egyptians treated the yearly flooding of the Nile, the ancient Egyptians, as a really big deal. For the obvious reason that if they didn't pay careful attention to it, they either drowned or starved. And years where the Nile didn't rise, didn't flood as much as it could have, were usually years where the harvests were bad, which was, well, not a good thing, right? So here we describe the variety of factors that describe a beaver pond. And look, in ecosystems and environments in general can be as small as rotting logs. In a sense, you could even state that any dead object, for that matter, such as a dead rat, can count as an ecosystem, in a sense. So we note that it's small and temporary, so it lasts years to decades. Some ecosystems last shorter, but many biologists decide not to study those. Why? Because they're so transient compared to years to decades. For the most part, very few people study any ecosystem that lasts less than a couple of months. Now here we observe that there are a variety of decomposing bacteria and fungi. Usually when you describe biotic factors, part of your concern is if it is not immediately obvious, you need to describe where the energy and the carbon comes from in the system. Why? Because energy is required for life, as you probably know. Carbon represents the chemical backbone of life on Earth, and water too. So the biotic and abiotic factors also need to concern themselves with these if it is not immediately obvious where the carbon that feeds the system is going to be coming from. For the boreal forest, or coniferous forest, or forests in general, or grasslands, it's pretty obvious where the carbon's coming from. So for the most part, people only state the main species of photosynthesizers. Here they note that the carbon and energy mostly come from decomposition. Now, we also note a function that this ecosystem can serve in the larger ecosystem of the forest. Ecosystems are not all created equal. Some big ecosystems contain smaller ecosystems, such as a pond in the middle of a forest with many ponds. Why is a forest with many ponds a big ecosystem? Well, it's because it interacts with these ponds, well, right? So if it interacts with these ponds, aren't the organisms in the pond and in the forest a community of interacting organisms? They are. So their surroundings are an ecosystem. But wait, the pond also interacts a lot with itself, and we can just study the pond's interactions within itself if we want. So if we just study that, then the pond is an ecosystem too. So we see that ecosystems can be nested. Biomes are a higher level, and typically biomes represent, say, taiga, boreal forest, and so on, a huge category of ecosystems. Sometimes, though, for now, ecosystems and biomes more or less overlap in the sense that we say coniferous forest ecosystem, when usually once you get later in grades it's classified as a biome. Now, we've all heard of the term sustainability. I really hope we have, otherwise somebody's been living under a rock. So, sustainability, how well the ecosystem can keep going. Essentially, the more sustainable the ecosystem, the better it is at keeping itself going. While human-made ecosystems tend to be pretty unstable, they are not usually sustainable. Natural ecosystems are, for the most part, sustainable. So, in summary, ecosystems are characterized by their biotic and abiotic factors. Well, okay, I mean, if you're going to describe something that's going to be a community of organisms and their environment, of course you're going to be describing the community of organisms and some of their interactions, biotic factors, and you're going to be describing the environment, the abiotic factors. Sounds pretty obvious, right? Now, biotic factors are living components of ecosystems, or the consequences of living components, such as nests or beaver dams. The dam itself is technically considered biotic by most researchers because it is built by the beavers. Abiotic factors are the non-living components. For example, the rainfall in the area, which allows the dam to form a pond, or the flooding that may occur downstream if the dam breaks. Or how conducive is the mud in the area to building a dam. A population is all the individuals of the same species living in an ecosystem. This depends on your definition. In higher grades, we will learn that a population is essentially just a group of interbreeding organisms of the same species. That's it. There may be several populations within one ecosystem. There may be also several populations within a community. And there comes the concept of metapopulation and all that stuff. But for now, let's just call it all individuals of the same species living in an ecosystem. A community is all organisms living in an ecosystem. So all the biotic factors put together, more or less, with the exception of course, the consequences, such as nests. Technically, those aren't considered part of the community. Natural ecosystems are generally sustainable, and unnatural ecosystems, made by humans, artificial ones, are generally unsustainable. They will not keep themselves going with only the natural energy input of the sun and some geothermal energy, depending on the case. Now, you've probably realized at some point that some people live in environments that are different from you. Some people live in temperate environments. Some people live in the tropics. There are reasons why houses up north or in colder climates have steeper roofs. They have snowfall, and the snow, if it was a flat roof, it would crush the house. So they have to let the snow slide off. So we see that the surrounding ecosystem, with all its abiotic and biotic factors, influences many aspects of our daily lives. In addition to the obvious abiotic factors, biotic factors also influence our daily lives. For example, malaria, other infectious diseases. These are all biotic factors of ecosystems that influence our daily lives. Or diseases that are zoogenic, i.e. from animals. I mean, you've probably heard of the various flu epidemics, right? Well, clearly, this sounds really obvious, which is good. If it's obvious, then you've grasped the material. So in the meantime, until our next lesson, you should do some practice problems or review a few books of your own. And we'll see you later.